mother there were 3 girls in my family until I was 14, and then my brother was born, and he was definitely God reincarnated, according to my mother. But as we 3 girls were growing up, my mother wanted us to be fine ladies. And so whenever we went someplace, we had to dress, in those little frilly dresses that you wear, that at that time sometimes were made out of flour sack material. I don't know if you guys know about those, but when you bought those great big bags of flour, the fabric was always beautifully decorated. And so you took them and you made clothes out of them. And whenever we went any place, we had to be dressed to the nines, white gloves. We learned how to curtsy. And at church or any place else, if they needed a speaker, call on Miss McFarland's daughters, because they can do it. And we would do it, because my mother would sit in that middle seat right in the front. And if you ever looked like you were not going to do it, all she had to do was give you that look. I don't know about anybody else, but if you got that look, whatever word you had forgotten, it's funny, you automatically remembered it. But among the things that she thought we needed to learn to be refined young ladies was, the first thing was learn how to crochet. And because at that time, everybody had those great big scarves across the back of the couch. And I don't know if you remember those big, they were crocheted, but they looked like great big crocheted bases. I don't know if you guys remember that, and they were starched. And so she paid Miss Neal, a lady in the neighborhood, $5 to teach us how to crochet. Well, didn't take them long to figure out that crochet was just not my thing. My sister Margaret, the middle sister, learned how to crochet. She had a scarf and all of this stuff going, and I hadn't even learned how to make a chain. And that's pretty bad. So they snatched me out of that. And we went on to do other things, like always being nice and proper and smiling and shaking hands, and of course wearing the white gloves when you went any place that was supposed to be extra special. And that was always that new big church in town, or when the relatives came out for a family reunion, and we would have to say, hello, how are you? Because if you didn't smile, then you were not a properly raised young lady. And then the next thing that we had, my mother, who was always about improving herself, was going to the adult school in our neighborhood. And then they opened up a sewing class, which she picked that up, and every night after work, she would go over and learn how to sew. Well, after she got good enough, she bought her own sewing machine. And of course, who learned how to sew? All of her daughters, right? On Saturdays, when we would normally go to the Vogue Theater, I don't know about any of you, but the Vogue Theater in Chula Vista was where all of the kids went on Saturdays after you finished your chores. You went on Saturdays. If you had a bike, you rode it into town, or your parents took you into town, dropped you off, and they were gone until dark. And you stayed there with your friends, you ate popcorn, you watched Al Lash LaRue on the screen. I don't know how many of you remember him, but he was there. And of course you had to have the Long Ranger and Tonto. And that's what you did all Saturday. And then when it got dark, all of these adults showed up, picked up kids. If you were close enough, you walked home. And that was a wonderful, wonderful Saturday. Because you knew on Sunday you were going to church, and you did nothing on Sunday but go to church and come home. That's it, prepare for Monday. But anyway, when the sewing got started, they finally figured out that was my spot. I could sew before anybody else, as long as you kept those seams straight. And with my mother, if that seam was not straight, you pulled that thread out and you started all over again. I see people shaking their heads. Been there, done that, huh? And sometimes you wound up with a hole because you had to pull it out until you got it absolutely straight. But I persevered. I managed to get it straight. I would use her sewing machine, and she was so very proud of me. But that took away our Vogue Theater Saturdays, because she would take us to Yardage City to buy fabric, and get the thread, and look at those great big pattern books. And we were really fortunate because my mother was a house cleaner, and she worked for the man who owned the store. So we could just wander around in the store, look at all the stuff, and that's where we would spend our Saturdays. Well, it must have been about 12 when that sewing machine entered my life. And then it was time for me to go to junior high school. And then they were also teaching home economics because they felt like people needed to learn how to sew and cook. It wasn't until I got to be in 10th grade that they decided we no longer needed to do that. We could buy all that in the store. And, but anyway, so I get into my junior high year and go into this home economics class. What are we making? An apron and a pot holder. And so I raised my hand and I said, I already know how to sew. Can I do something else? Which my teacher, Miss Hines, little short lady, who was just absolutely mean because she didn't let you do what you wanted to do, said, no, you have to do what everybody else does. Well, I already had a plan. I was going to take my apron home and get it all finished and bring it back. Not such a good plan because at that time teachers talked to parents. And Mrs. Hines called my mom and they had a discussion. And I wound up being the one who helped the others who could not sew. And then all of my friends called me teacher's pet. Which, you know, I didn't think I was the teacher's pet. For me, that was something that I did not want to do. I wanted to make something else. Anyway, we went through junior high with me fighting all the way with the gathered skirts that we had to make. Everybody had to make, what was it, a 1-yard gathered skirt or something like that we had to make. Anyway, got into high school. Home economics was still there. And you could choose what you wanted to make. Well, my mother decided that, in fact, they were going to have a fashion show. So my mother, loving to show off her girls, chose this suit for me to make. And it had to be lined and had to have shoulder pads because, you know, you don't wear suits without shoulder pads in those days. So I made this suit, and then we had to have a fashion show. Once again, Mom stepped in. I had to learn how to walk like the models. I had to learn how to walk in high heels and wear stockings and get my hairdresser on to do my hair and my makeup. And of course, I won first place. And just about that time, they had a contest for Miss Otay, which is where I grew up, in Chula Vista. And I wore that suit, and I won again. And so that suit was the topic of conversation for quite a while. Not only that, I was able to every weekend make myself a new outfit, which made my cousin very jealous. And so every weekend, she too would make a new outfit. And as fate would have it, she would make the same thing that I was making. That's when my mother stepped in. And so every week, she would make sure that I had something different, a different pattern, a very expensive piece of fabric. And, well, my cousin and I were no longer good friends. But my mother was the one who opened that door, that portal to sewing for me. And here I am.